Okay, we are live. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us on Torah Anytime, for joining us on Zoom and on Facebook Live. We were having a bit of banter before, so I'd just like to tell this story before we get into what we're about to say. I have told this story here before, but I always find this is it's a very funny story. I remember we once had a taxi driver who told me that we were on our way actually to pick up my in-laws from the airport. They were coming to visit us for Sukkot. As the first time we were having my in-laws over for Sukkot, and we were a young couple. In hindsight, we were stupid to do that because we just were so unprepared in having guests. We were 6 months married, and we had, the first 2 months we hadn't really lived in Israel, and we were just first time Sukkot, first time making Yom Tov. It was a disaster. Suddenly we turn out like, oh gosh, your in-laws, your parents are coming in like half an hour. We took everything, just threw it in our room, shut the door, and hoped for the best. But be that as it may, we were on the way to the airport with a taxi, and the taxi driver, I said to him, we're going to pick up my in-laws. So he told me the following story. He said, a few years ago, this Israeli cab driver, he was taking a couple from Har Nof to Ramot. So a decent length journey. It probably takes a good 20 minutes in Israel to go from one to the other. It's Friday afternoon, and he looks at the guy and he says to him, hey, buddy, lighten up. It just looks like you're going to your in-laws or something. And he said that as a joke. Wife suddenly from behind starts screaming, see, I told you, every time we go to my parents, you make that face. I told you don't like going to my parents. Why don't you like going? And she started screaming at him, just like mad, literally for the next 15 minutes of the cab ride. She's berating her husband. And this guy's like, I opened up a can of worms over here. I was trying to make a joke. All I was trying to do is to have a little laugh. And I created this huge shalom. She goes, hey, listen, guys, I'll take you for free. It was a joke. Forget it. The fare is on me. Stop fighting. Please, I beg of you to stop fighting. But, Israeli. So sometimes you say things, Maureen, and it doesn't go the way you think it goes, right? You open up your mouth and you make a joke, and if that becomes a whole argument. I see you like that story. It was very humorous when that happened. Anyway, let's get started. Okay. People have a very interesting view about Parshas Mishpatim, and that is that Mishpatim is boring. That it's interesting until you get to Parshas. Start off with the creation of the world, and then you get to Noach, and then you get to Avraham Avinu, and then you get to Yitzchak Avinu, and you get to Yaakov Avinu, and Yosef and the brothers. Then you get to Egypt, and the plagues in Egypt, and coming out of Egypt, and the drowning of the first of everyone. And then you get to the giving of the Torah, and now we reach Mishpatim. And now the Torah gets into the whole bit about how many times an ox gored somebody else, and how much you have to pay. Sell this one, and what happens if something falls into a pit? Excuse me. And it seems to go, people feel sometimes that it went downhill. We were doing so well, and then we went in the wrong direction. Do you know what I mean, Ivor? I see you're shaking your head. Well, this is Gemara is very much based. I mean, you look at Parshas Mishpatim. Where did you start? Oh, really? Okay, so, Bava Kama is brilliant. They're all brilliant, but this has a lot of Bava Kamas based on this, where the oxen and the zikim and the chav and the chaver is all in there. But if you're looking for story and you're looking for excitement, often people feel this is not where it's at. Even though there's a little bit of story at the end. Maybe get to Bamidbar, you get back into story. But now we're going to go through a dry patch. So much so somebody said to me at one point, he says, Rabbi, you don't mind, but after Yisro, I'll excuse myself. Next year, you come back to Bereshis, I'll come back in. But there are so many important lessons to be learned. These things. You might say, oh, come on, what are you going to learn? He has to pay twice, or he has to pay once, so he has to be flogged. What are you going to learn from all these things? The answer is plenty.
You learn how fair Torah law is.
You learn how fair Torah law is, but I think beyond that, there are many things that you have to learn. So I'll give you an example. This is I felt this was a beautiful piece by Rav Sham Shafal Hirsch. It's at the end, actually, of the first two bits. So if I were to ask you, what are the first two items that you would want to put into Parshas Mishpatim? I'm telling you, we are now set in a judicial system. and you have a choice to throw the first thing at me, what would you say? Stealing. Maybe you tell me about tort law and damage. But you know what we're talking about? The first thing speaks about the Eved Ivri. You have a guy that stole. And when he steals and he can't afford to pay back, we sell him as a slave. And the halachas of him as a slave. And how he has to do and what happens if he goes out and what happens if he doesn't want to go out, etc., etc. End of the first one of the laws. Law number 2. The Amma Ivriya. You have the woman who was sold by her father. Again, I think we spoke about this at length last year. We did speak about Rav Hirsch as a whole piece that we're talking about over here. A man, the Torah does not advocate selling your daughter. I know recently I've seen a paper and there are people that say, oh, Jewish people are into forced marriage, etc., etc. We do not advocate for this at all. Please, nobody should say that this is what the Torah wants. Torah does not want this from you. But we're dealing with somebody who's down and out. He's got no money left and he cannot support his daughter. And the only way for him to be able to support his daughter is by selling her on to somebody else. And hoping that that person will actually take her and marry this girl. But the Torah is not saying, go ahead and sell your daughter, please. Nobody should read the Torah and say, we are on page 418 in the Art Scroll. Verse 7. If you sell your daughter as a slave, she shouldn't go out like the servants go out, but rather she goes out even when she becomes just 12 years old, she's able to go out. A lot of discussion over here, but it seems almost, again, it doesn't make sense that that's the first thing to be discussed. We're discussing over here an instance that the Torah sees really as a b'di'eved. The Torah sees this as a last resort. This is not something we're advocating. So why are we giving you this last resort idea? Why are we telling you two things that seem to be A, pretty esoteric, B, not very practical? I mean, how many times has this happened? What's the Torah trying to tell you here? The very important idea that Rav Hirsch says that's brought out over here, which I think is a beautiful idea, and that's the following. If you have a look at the idea of the Eved Ivri, the Gemara said if you buy an Eved Ivri, Kona Odon La'atzmo, you buy yourself a master. This is not good. It's not fun for somebody to own an Eved Ivri. If you have one pillow, you must give it to your servant. If you only have one bed, you only have one blanket, you must treat him royally. You must bring his family in, etc., etc. It really has a lot of laws making sure that this Eved Ivri is taken care of. Not only that, it's not brought here in Mishpatim, but the halacha says later on in Parshas Behar that you cannot work in Befarach. You're not allowed to give an Eved Ivri, a Jewish slave, you're not allowed to give him any work that is considered over laborious, if there is such a word. I don't know if there is such a word, right? But what it means is the following. You cannot make him work for no reason. Wake up this morning, you say, you know what? I got nothing to do. I got nothing to give my servant or my slave to do. I don't want him to sit and do nothing. You know what I'm going to do? So you know what you do? I mean, the Germans, Yimach Shemam, they did this. They literally got people in the concentration camps to dig holes, and what they did after they dig the hole? Fill them in. It's so demoralizing. I've seen people trying to dig. When you have to dig a grave, Nebuch, when a person has to dig a grave. So we have the people from the Cemeteries Trust. But there have been times where the Cemetery Trust has not been working. So, for example, on Xmas, we've had days sometimes where the Cemeteries Trust, where the non-Jewish fellow of the Cemetery Trust says, look, I'm not digging any graves. This is my holiday. And good on him. Yeah, he deserves his holiday. But somebody died and we needed a grave. So what happened? The Misaskin came forward and they dug a grave. It takes they have to learn how to do it, and you have to do it in layers, and it takes a good 2-3 hours to dig a grave. It's not something that you just go, oh, let's dig a grave, it'll take 15 minutes. It takes about 15 minutes to fill the thing, and that's when you already have all the earth next to it, and you just got to shovel it back in. When you got to pull out that earth one bit at a time, when it's part of the ground, and you got to stick your spade in, and you got to get your foot in, and you got to take a bit out, it's hard That's Mayor, probably, if you see somebody walking back there. It's hard work. It's not easy. You can't do that to you. So you want somebody to dig a hole? What for? Just to keep them busy. And then fill it in again. Do you know how demoralizing it is to spend hours and hours of work to dig a hole, only have to take all that earth and shovel it straight back in? But that was what the Germans did. They not only wanted to kill the people, but until they killed them, they made them do the most demoralizing things. They wanted to take away their humanity, for them to feel subhuman, because that's how they looked at them. So we can dream. You dig a hole, fill it in again. Dig a hole over here, now fill that one in. And then once somebody's dug enough holes and they're not useful anymore, you shoot them, you leave them in the hole and dig them in. That's what they did. In Machshama. You're not allowed to do that to your Eved. You're not allowed to do that to your slave or to your servant. You have to treat them properly. So we have over here all these halachas about the slave, how he needs to be treated, how his family needs to be treated, how you give him the royal treatment, etc., etc. We move on from there to the next thing. You have this woman who's been sold. So you have the fellow that is as poor as it gets. So poor that he feels he's got no choice but to give his daughter up to somebody else. At least there she'll have a shelter. At least there she'll have food. She'll be taken care of. Again, as we said, not something that we advocate, but a last ditch resort. Right? You just try your best not to get into that situation. And the fellow who buys her has to treat her properly. The same halachas of the Eved. If he wants to marry her, he can marry her, but only under certain conditions. And the Torah says, and by the way, when you marry this woman, she's like any other wife that you have. You have no right to treat her any less than any other woman. You say, well, she came upon because some fellow who was the schnorrer of all schnorrers, couldn't even afford to keep his own daughter, and I bought this woman, I get to treat her like anything. No, you don't. No, you don't. That's not her fault that her father's poor. You treat her like any other woman. You have no right to give her any less than any other wife. And you go through this whole thing. And then you get to the end of it. And you see, if you do this, that's what you're allowed to do. If you do this, you're only allowed to do that. If you don't do anything, if you're not going to marry her, or she stays with you until she reaches a certain age, then she just goes out for free. Finished. Done. But under no circumstances are you to treat her badly. And Rav Hirsch says, you know what we start with? We start with the two individuals in society that seem to get a rough deal. Number one, the individual in society that gets a rough deal is the convict or the ganav. Call him what you want. So take a guy, I'm reading this book, different books that I read. I read this book about speaking. So they speak about a famous lawyer, solicitor in America, lawyer who argues cases in front of the Supreme Court by the name of Bryan Stevenson. Bryan Stevenson is a famous speaker because he spoke at the TED conference and he received the longest standing ovation ever at the TED conference. And his TED speech has gone viral, millions of views, etc., etc. So much so he convinced people without asking them. He didn't even ask them. He spoke at TED, and by the time he came home, people at the TED conference had donated $1 million to his charity unsolicited. He never asked for any money. He was just telling them about what he does. And what this Bryan Stevenson does is he argues, he has a charity, and he argues cases for, in the main, black African-American people that are on death row to say that they've not been given a fair trial. And you know what? Many a time they've not been given a fair trial. And he said, at the moment in America, I don't know if this was the statistic he gave at the time, I don't know if the statistic is still 100% correct, he said, African Americans between the age of 18 and 30 are either in jail, on parole, or have a criminal record. 1/3 of them in America. And he says they just don't have the same treatment. They don't have the same opportunities, and many things go wrong for them. And that's why you have that. And he says he's been able to get 78, again at the time of the writing of this book, 78 death row inmates in Alabama, black death row inmates in Alabama, he's gotten off the death penalty by proving that either when they were tried, they weren't given a fair trial, or there was some kind of racism or something else involved there. But the down and outs, people are like, you know what? He killed someone, shoot him up. You know, he's in jail. What rights does it? You ask people, if you say to people, you know, you go to people in jail, they get good food. Not only they get good food, they get to watch football matches, and sometimes they even have cable television. You're like, cable TV in jail? Let them rot. Let them get nothing. Let them eat broth and old bread. Yeah? I'm sure a lot of people feel that way. And the Torah is saying, you might have somebody that's done something wrong. You might have an individual over here that's a ganav. He's a felon. No nice way around it. This guy stole. And he needs to be sold in order to pay for what he did, because the bottom line is you need to take responsibility for what you did. You did something wrong. You stole. You can't afford to pay back. There's no going bankrupt. Then sell yourself and pay it back that way. But then those things say, oh, whoops, I don't have the money for it. And therefore what? And therefore you don't obligate to pay it back. We'll find another way to get it. Does that mean you lose all your rights just because you stole? That doesn't mean you lose all your rights. Because a person is not the Aveira that he does. So just because he stole doesn't mean forever he's a ganav and he deserves no respect and no rights whatsoever. Yes, he might have stolen. Yes, he needs to make retribution and he needs to pay back whatever he did, whatever he stole. But he's still an individual. He's still a human being that deserves to be treated as a human being. And the next is the poor person. So many times, I mean, when you come back to you put the two of them together, I was speaking about before, but there's a fellow, Brian Stevenson, is number one, he deals with black people who are often already, there's a racial prejudice against them, and a lot of them are probably poor, which is why they didn't have access to being fairly represented. So the poor person in society oftentimes gets a rough deal. The rich person gets away with almost everything, and the poor people don't. Right? Now, I'm not a socialist, don't get me wrong. I'm not advocating over here that everybody should give up their property, etc., etc. That's not what I'm saying. But poor people oftentimes, they almost always will have a much, much harder lot in life than people with money. And they won't be treated the same, and they won't be given the same respect. So if you walk into a bank and you're dressed, even just like me, I'm not dressed to the hills, but if you walk in, you're wearing a tie, you're wearing a suit, you're wearing a shirt, you go, hello, sir, come on in. If you walk in tattered clothes, what's the bank going to do for you? They're not going to do the same. They're going to look at you and go, what do you want? But that guy might have more money to his name. He just might have gotten lynched by a dog, which is why his suit is torn or something. I don't know why he's dressed the way he is. He still might have a lot more money than I do. He just doesn't look like it. But they look at the person, they look the way he's dressed, they look at who he is, and they say, poor person, not the same. Doesn't get the same equal treatment. I'm sure they must have done these social experiments. I'm sure they've done these social experiments. I think, what was it? They've done social experiments about, somebody coming to borrow your phone, or a poor person coming and asking you to borrow to get some money, and then another, you had the guy who's well-dressed, he comes over to somebody else and busts up, he goes, oh, so sorry. I didn't take my money with me. I need $2 for the bus. Do you have $2? Sure, no problem. Yep, gave him $2 without problem. Guy gets on the bus. Afterwards, a guy comes tattered clothes, goes, excuse me, sir, I need to get on the bus. Get out of here, you hobo. A second ago, you gave $2 to the other guy. It's not like you don't want to give away $2. The same guy 5 minutes ago gave $2 to the guy who was wearing a suit. Yeah, this guy deserves my $2. Him, he's a hobo. What money does he deserve? So we look at the poor people and we give them an unfair trial. We don't give them the same rights. Says the Torah, the first thing that Parshas Mishpatim tells us, this is what Rav Shan Rav Hirsch teaches us. The first thing in Parshas Mishpatim is to say, even if you're a felon, even if you're a criminal, doesn't mean you don't deserve to be treated okay. Doesn't mean that we're going to treat you worse than anybody else. You'll have to make restitution. You'll have to pay for what you did. but fair treatment. You're a poor person, so therefore you don't deserve a fair trial. Therefore your daughter deserves to be just used and abused. Chas v'shalom. Never. Says the Torah, you're going to buy this girl. He's down and out. The guy's got no money whatsoever. He doesn't know what to do. He has to come to the terrible step where he has to sell his daughter to make sure that she has a place to sleep and a place to eat, etc., etc. And this man now wants to marry and he says, I'm going to treat her like some slave. Says the Torah, don't you dare. The same as any other woman. If you were to marry a woman from the wealthiest family, you marry a Rothschild, or you marry the poorest woman in the world, they get to be treated the same. Don't think because she doesn't come from money, therefore you can treat her like dirt. That's the first thing the Torah tells us. When it comes to the law, when it comes to looking at people, understanding who people are, and treating people properly, the Torah says, if you're poor or if you're a criminal, whoever you might be, you deserve equal treatment. Nobody should treat you worse for the fact that you've done something wrong or that you don't have money. And if people treat you worse for that, they have no idea what mishpatim are in the Torah. They don't really understand what it means. When the Torah gives us chukim u'mishpatim, the Torah gives us statutes to keep and laws to keep. The laws are there to protect everyone, even the most vulnerable and even those that have slipped and done something wrong. That's what the laws are for. That's what we're here to protect. Okay, that's the first idea that's brought here by Rav Shamshon Hirsch. The Oznaim the Torah makes another point. I think we've spoken about this in the past, but I think I just thought it was a very beautiful idea that I'd like to share with you. There's Oznaim the Torah says, of all the things, again, the same question that we said before, of all the things that the Torah could have started with, why do we start with the Eved Ivri? We're starting here with the slave, the Jewish slave, and telling you that the Jewish slave deserves to be treated properly, and you're not allowed to do this to the slave, and you're not allowed to do that to the slave. You have to treat him fairly, as we just mentioned before. So as Oznaim the Torah asks the question, it says, I don't understand. You know what we're dealing with, or you know who we're talking about over here? We're talking about the Jewish people. We're talking about, right, that the mishpatim were given when? 3-4 months after they left Israel. 2.5 months after they left Israel. Right after, Kodesh Baruch Hu gave them together with at Har Sinai. So Har Sinai is only 2 months after they leave. So you look back and you say to them, you were just slaves. Just 3 months ago you were slaves. We need to tell a nation that had endured so much pain and so much suffering as slaves, we need to tell them how to treat slaves? Surely they know to give slaves fair treatment. Who else would know better than the Jews who had suffered so much? Who else is going to know about fair treatment of slaves if not for the Klal Yisrael? So why is the Torah telling you here about fair treatment of slaves? That doesn't seem to be something we need to talk about. So the Oznaim the Torah doesn't tell this story, but I'll tell you this story. It's a famous story that they tell, but I think it's a very telling story. There was a poor man in town, and there was a friend of his who had more money, and he came to the poor man and he says, listen, I think you should buy a lottery ticket. He says, why should I buy a lottery ticket? He says, you have such trouble. You suffer so much from this poverty. Buy a lottery ticket. You stand a chance. Maybe you'll win. No, I'm not. Look, the Euro Millions this week is $100 million. $100 million. Tonight, 126 million pounds, right? Buy a Euro Millions ticket. Come on, do it for yourself. Do it for your family. What's it cost? £2.50? Give yourself a chance. No, I'm not going to buy it. It's stupid. I don't need to do it. Can I buy you one? I don't want one. Do you know what? I'll make you a deal. I'll buy you a ticket. If you win, it's yours. If you lose, it's cost you nothing. I was like, all right, whatever. If you're so set on me buying a lottery ticket, fine. Anyway, the fellow buys the lottery ticket, sticks it in his pocket, forgets about it. Then that night, they call out the numbers, and he's sitting at home at 12 o'clock at night, and he goes, oh, forgot the lottery ticket. So he pulls out his computer and he goes, let's Google tonight's winning numbers. And he's looking at the numbers. 1, 2, 3, 4. Oh my gosh, you got 5 right. 2 lucky stars, 1. I don't believe it. He just won 126 million pounds. This guy overnight has gone from being a pauper to being literally the richest guy that he knows. And nobody in this community has that kind of money. And he's just so excited. And he gets into his car, gets out of his drum, he gets dressed, he's all excited. He drives to Yankel's house, knocks on Yankel's door. Dark, everything. It's 2 o'clock in the morning. He's knocking and knocking. Finally, Yankel opens up the window. He goes, who's knocking on my door? He goes, it's me, Beryl. Beryl, what in the world are you doing here at 2 o'clock in the morning? So Beryl says, I came to give you good news. He says, really, what's the good news? Yankel, you won 126 million pounds. You're a millionaire. Yankel looks down at Beryl and Yankel says to Beryl, you really have the chutzpah of waking up the wealthiest man in town at 2 o'clock in the morning. How dare you? Now, why am I telling you this story? We change very quickly. We don't remember how things were. And things change around. And suddenly, the thing that you suffered with, very easily, you could forget that. It could become something totally different. My father always used to say there was an Indian man who went to Savile Row, and he got himself a suit, and he got dressed up, and now he looks like an Englishman. And he starts crying, and they say, what are you crying about? And I can't believe you lost all the colonies. So I mean, like, what do you mean? You're from India, you were part of the colonies. Yeah, but now he's wearing a suit, and has become an Englishman. You forget. Totally. Says Oznaim Latara, he says, you think just because the Jewish people were slaves, they'd come out and they'd say, we'll never ever treat anybody like we were treated in Mitzrayim. Yeah, maybe. For the first month, maybe for the first year. 2 years down the line, not so sure anymore. 5 years down the line, we've forgotten about it. It's rare. It's rare that people remember where they came from and still give that amount, and still look at themselves like they were in that position. I told you the story recently about this fellow. Did I tell you the story about the guy? The very wealthy man who gave more than his share to charity? The very wealthy man here in Manchester that used to give a tremendous amount to charity. And at one point or another, the HMRC, the English IRS, sorry, that's for the Americans on the who are listening to this. So the HMRC, the Revenue and Customs, they called over and they said, Mr. So-and-so, we don't understand. You're giving away so much money to charity. How does that work? That just doesn't make any sense. And the fellow said, let me explain something to you. When I was a child, we lived in Israel, and my father passed away, and I was a Yossam. Nebuchadnezzar was an orphan. He says, when I was an orphan, we were so poor we couldn't afford anything. And we used to sometimes have these like little trips in school. And what they cost already? 10 shekel, 20 shekel. We couldn't afford that. So we always made excuses why we couldn't go. I made an excuse like this, an excuse like that. This is probably in hindsight, if people would have known. Many times I have seen this. You know, if a classmate would have known that his classmate, who's the Yossam, can't afford to go on the trip for 20 shekels, I'm sure 10 parents would stand up and say, I will pay. Don't let this child not come. Sometimes they don't want that. Anyway, that's how it is. So he says he didn't go on any of these trips. He missed out so much as a Yossam. He says, and today I have money. But when I hear about other people suffering, and I remember when I was a child how I suffered, and I remember that I couldn't go on the trips, or I couldn't do this, I couldn't do that because of money, when I hear the plight of somebody else, I can't help myself. I have to give. I can't but not give. But that's somebody who actually remembers. He says, I was a Yossam. I will never do that to anybody else. I'll make sure that nobody else has to suffer the indignity that I suffered. But many times, the same people that went through that indignity, the same people that went through those trials and tribulations, they grow up and they forget. You forget who you were. You forget you also didn't once have money. Sometimes you get people, they were poor and then they become rich. The guy couldn't make it in Parnassa, couldn't make Parnassa, and finally, he comes with an idea and he does well and he buys property and he does even better. Now suddenly he's become one of the big shots in town. And all his old friends, the guys he used to hang out with and the guys who were his best friends, who used to sit with in shul and used to moan about the law and everything, suddenly he's got new friends. Why? Those guys no good anymore? No, they don't really have the money. We're not really the same social strata. They were good enough recently. They were good enough 2 years ago. Those are the guys that carried you when things were difficult. And not only that, you speak to people who have made money and then sadly lost their money. Many of them will tell you the hardest thing is not losing the money. That's not so hard. The hardest thing is you had people that you thought were your friends and they're part of your social circle and you hung out with them and you ate by them and they ate by you and we were all one big crowd, and suddenly one of them loses his money and he's not part of the crowd anymore. But just because I don't have an extra 0, 2 zeros in my bank account, I'm not your friend. And then you look back and you say, does that mean I was never your friend? Does that mean I always was just the tag along? What does that mean? And people say, much harder than losing the money is losing the friendships, is losing the people that you thought were part of your social circle. You thought these were your friends. You thought these were the people that really cared for you. And suddenly they stab you in the back and say, well, sorry, no money. Sorry, can't hang out with us. But last week I was good enough. Or the week before that I was good enough. Yeah, then you had money. Also, you never liked me, only liked my bank account. That's a very tough pill to swallow. Very, very hard. And what the Torah is saying over here is, we need to tell you this right at the beginning, because we need to remind Klal Yisrael, never forget your roots. Never forget where you come from. I find it interesting, actually, sometimes you hear people, I don't know why, there's Jews, there are plenty of people that are racist. There's no nice way of saying it. And you think to yourself, you know what? We've not had the easiest ride throughout history. We've had it hard in so many countries. We've been kicked out of so many countries. Now at the moment, we are enjoying a relative period of calm, both in America, in the UK, in Europe, in a few countries. In some countries it's getting worse. So now you look at other minorities and you sneer at them? Oh, the Polish people are coming over and taking everybody's job. Look at those black people. Look at those Asians. Look at those. Look at this one. Who are you to make a comment? 70 years ago, nobody wanted to look at you. They all wanted to throw you into the gas chambers and burn you. That's what they wanted to do. And sometimes I feel like we who are in these glass, and who are we to suddenly become these racists? Why? Why are you doing that? Why are you talking down on another race when nobody seems to like us that much either? It's not like we are this well-accepted member of this society and we can look at everybody else. And even if we were, so many years throughout our entire history, we've been the people that have been shunned. Why are we shunning other people now? That's amazing. Oh, people have short memories. So yes, in 1930s and 1940s, we were the Nebuchs and everything. But we made our way out. We're not the Nebuchs anymore. And now we can make fun of other different minorities. Why would you do that? Because that's what the Rav Sorotskin is telling you. Because you forget. Because you don't remember that you were once in that position also. You don't remember that we were also the downtrodden. Because we're not the downtrodden anymore. Now we're the successful people. Now we have more millionaires per capita than almost any other country. And we have more Nobel Prize winners, and we have more this, and we have more that, and therefore we're the big shots. But don't forget where you came from. Don't forget where you came from is the first lesson the Torah is telling us. Don't forget that you were an Eved in Mitzrayim. You think now I'm out and therefore I'm not an Eved anymore and therefore I can treat any slave the way I want to. No, remember where you came from. Remember how badly you got treated in Egypt. Don't ever do that to anybody else. Don't treat anybody like that. But if the Torah didn't tell us, we'd forget. And as I've shown you over here, we've forgotten in many different instances. We forget very quickly who we were and who our friends used to be. And sometimes we get that very rude wake-up call, but we don't really want that rude wake-up call. We really need to remember who we are. And the more we have a conscious memory of, as a Jewish people, who we are, what we represent, and who we're supposed to be, the better we are as a people. And the more we think we can forget about our past, just put that all behind us and say, now we're new people. Now we're not that kind of people anymore. Don't forget who you are, because it's important. It shapes who you are. It should shape your reality, and it should shape your character. And understanding that we once were slaves in Egypt means never treat a slave like the way you were treated. They don't deserve that. Nobody deserves that treatment, and you don't deserve to give anybody else that treatment. And if you forget, that's the worst thing. So the first thing we tell you in the beginning of Mishpatim is, remember where you came from. Remember who you are. Don't start treating others badly just because you're now on the up. Just because you're on the up doesn't mean you can trot on the people that are downtrodden. Okay? Those are the two ideas I wanted to share with you tonight. Thank you so much for joining us live. Thank you for those who joined us on Facebook Live, on Zoom, and on Torah Anytime. If you want to get in touch, davideisenberg@gmail.com, and look forward to seeing you next week.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.